The title of this year's lecture is Reparations for African Americans in the 21st Century. As we all know, this topic of reparations is really a crucial one in our times. But the idea of reparations has been around for some time, certainly since racial slavery began its existence in the United States. And since the abolition of slavery in the 1860s, it has become an even more critical topic. And certainly for today, we know through Black Lives Matter and other movements that there's been a real call for a call for reparations, a broad call for reparations, which has many aspects to it. Reparations for unpaid labor for slavery, reparations that may have to do with what some people call reparative justice, reparations that may have to do with what some people call repair. But whatever kind of tack or way in which one thinks about reparations, it is really a germane topic that is not going to go away. And it will not go away because we in the United States have not yet confronted the history of racial slavery and its consequences. This afternoon, we have two really very important speakers who have thought about this topic for some time. They have just produced a book together called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. The two speakers are Kirsten Mullen, who is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice and the Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. As a faculty member with the Community Life Documentation Institute, she trained its students to research and record the state's African-American musical heritage. Kirsten was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's project, the North Carolina Legends, and the Civil Rights Exhibition project. Her writings in museum catalogs, journals, and in the commercial media includes Black Culture and History Matters in the American Prospect, which examines the politics. This article examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. She and our other speaker, Professor William Darity, are the authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published this year. Other speaker is William Sandy Darity, Professor Sandy Darity, who is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. I should also say Professor Darity is an alum of Brown. She reminded me of just before we began this broadcast. Professor Darity's research focuses on equality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification, economics, schooling, and the racial achievement gap. North-South theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. As I said, he is the other person of the duo who wrote that, both he and Kirsten have written this book, From Here to Equality, Reparations to Black Americans in the 21st Century. The way we will do this is that both of them will speak for 40 minutes together, and we'll begin with Ms. Kirsten Mullen, followed by William Darity. Then we will do a Q&A. Catherine, for those of you who have been attending our webinars. Catherine will read out the questions. You will put your questions on the Q&A, and then we will answer. Both William and Kirsten will answer those questions, and then from there, we will do a wrap up at around 5:26 or so with final remarks before we finish at 5:30. So once again, I want to welcome you all to this webinar, which I think has a very timely topic, given where we are in this country at this moment. So let's begin with Kirsten Mullen. Ms. Mullen.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We are delighted to be speaking with you today. We're going to go back and forth, actually quite a bit in our presentation. And but I want to begin by framing the conversation with a description of what we mean by reparations. Reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for grievous injustice. Where African Americans are concerned, the grievous injustices that make the case for reparations include slavery, legal segregation, or Jim Crow, and ongoing discrimination and stigmatization. ARC, A-R-C, the acronym that stands for Acknowledgement, Redress, and Closure, characterizes the three essential elements of the reparations program that we are advocating. Acknowledgement, redress, and closure are components of an effective reparations project. Acknowledgement involves recognition and admission of the wrong by the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of the injustice. For African Americans, this means the receipt of a formal apology and a commitment for redress on the part of the American people as a whole, a national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed. But beyond an apology, acknowledgement requires those who benefited from the exercise of the atrocities to recognize the advantages they gained and commit themselves to the cause of redress. Redress potentially can take two forms, not necessarily mutually exclusive: restitution or atonement. Restitution is the restoration of survivors to their condition before the injustice occurred, or to a condition they might have attained had the injustice not taken place. Of course, it's impossible to restore those who were enslaved to a condition preceding their enslavement, not only because those who were enslaved are now deceased, but also because many thousands were born into slavery. But it is possible to move their descendants toward a more equitable position commensurate with the status they would have attained in the absence of the injustices. Atonement, as an alternative form of redress, occurs when perpetrators or beneficiaries meet conditions of forgiveness that are acceptable to the victims. Achieving these elements of a reparations program requires good faith negotiations between those who were wronged and the wrongdoers. There is no existing mechanism for establishing when African Americans collectively will have reached an agreement that sufficient steps have been taken to justify forgiveness. Consequently, atonement is difficult to accomplish. That is why in our proposal, we treat restitution as the appropriate form of redress. We have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that we do not have for establishing the same for atonement. Specifically, restitution for African Americans would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing, and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. It will require not only an endeavor to compensate for past repression and exploitation, but also an endeavor to offset stubborn existing obstacles to full Black participation in American political and social life. Reparations demonstrably would be effective if an improved position for Blacks is associated with sharp and enduring reductions in racial disparities, particularly economic disparities like racial wealth inequality, and corresponding sharp and enduring improvements in Black well-being. Closure involves mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination towards Blacks. Whites and Blacks would come to terms over the past, confront the present, and unite to create a new and transformed United States of America. Once the reparations program is executed and racial inequality eliminated, African Americans would make no further claims for race-specific policies on their behalf from the American government on the assumption that no new race-specific injustices are inflicted upon them.
So before I begin to interject my portion of our presentation, I would like to say thank you very much for having the opportunity, for giving us the opportunity to do the Debra Lee lecture. I actually was in school at Brown with Debra Lee. I probably shouldn't say that because that might reveal how long ago she was in school also. But she is one of the most impressive entrepreneurial figures in America today. And so quite thrilled to have the opportunity to present the lecture in her name. I'd like to begin by pointing out that one of the critical dimensions of our analysis of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is building a case that's predicated not exclusively or solely upon slavery. And in fact, we have strong reservations about the use of the phrase slavery reparations. We think it's critical to keep in mind that there's a host of events that took place after slavery ended that are relevant to the case for reparations. And these events, in a cumulative sense, have produced the kinds of consequences that are associated with the lives of individuals who are descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, their lives today that are truncated, that are shortened, and that are have restricted opportunities in comparisons with others in the United States. And so that's why we make a case that's more extensive or expansive than claims about the harms of slavery, however horrific slavery was in and of itself. And so we say the following in our book: from here to equality draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build in this volume is based on all three tiers or phases of injustice: slavery, American apartheid or legal segregation in the United States, and the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of Black lives. Most advocates of Black reparations have focused solely on the injustice of slavery as the basis for redress. Law professor Boris Bitker argued that the case for Black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation, while Roy L. Brooks, also a legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for Black reparations is the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We submit that the Bill of Particulars for Black reparations also must include contemporary ongoing injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the Black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Sociologist Joe Fagan catalogs the continuing injuries inflicted on Black Americans, including wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown versus Board decision in 1954, despite a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal apartheid in the United States, and despite the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, Blacks continue to bear the burden of American racism. That burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system writ large, and a general social disdain for the value of Black people's lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon Black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these three tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination, makes a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. Now, we want to argue that the most powerful indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of the various atrocities that we've described here, we can put these atrocities under the heading of white supremacy in the United States, but the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy in the United States, the best economic indicator of those effects is the racial wealth disparity in the United States. What's the magnitude of that difference in wealth between Blacks and whites? Well, I think it's best exemplified by the fact that the average Black household in the United States has $850,000 less in net worth than the average white household in the United States. Indeed, this corresponds to a circumstance in which the Black population of the United States is about 13%, but the Black share in wealth held in the United States is only about 2.5%. So a primary objective from our standpoint of a reparations plan for Black American descendants of US slavery must be to bring the Black share of wealth at least into proportion or consistent proportion with the Black share of the US population. We estimate that this would require somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion in expenditure. Closing the racial wealth gap is a primary or fundamental objective of a reparations plan on behalf of Black American descendants of US slavery.
Because of our training, of our education, have a better understanding of the Southern states' connection to slavery and its legacy. But I want to talk a little bit about the relationship of the North to the institution, in particular, New York City, to that history. One exceptional publication we discovered early, Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, by Anne Farrow, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank, trace the trade beginning in 1641, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony legally recognized the institution of slavery. Virginia was already a slave trading site at this time, but Massachusetts was the first to legally sanction servitude. Supplying provisions for these enslaved people and for the vast plantations in the Caribbean and South America required the efforts of staggering numbers of merchants and shippers, financiers, insurers, real estate brokers, auctioneers, and laborers. Not everyone was on board, and some actually opposed slavery and the slave trade on moral or religious grounds, but the profits were just too great for many people to pass up. Ship ports of Providence, Rhode Island, Boston, Salem, Massachusetts, a round robin of outgoing vessels carrying dairy products, fish, rum. These were following vessels unloading human chattel, sugar, and molasses. The export of these goods, especially exports to the West Indies and to plantations in the American South, made possible the dramatic expansion of commerce in New England, the purchase of luxury goods from Europe, financial security, and a lifestyle of leisure unavailable up to that time. And because all commercial roads led to the slave trade, although many people owned at least one Black body, one need not actually have owned slaves to profit from the slave trade. Newspapers like the Hartford, Connecticut Courant, which dates from 1764 and is still being published, profit from the sale of advertisements supporting the sale and capture of slaves, adverts for slave ship crews, the provisioning of slave ships and plantations, and the sale of slave-made goods. Aetna is one of a host of insurance companies that provided coverage for slave ships and their cargoes. At least 5,000 slaves were insured in Connecticut in 1790 alone. And according to Lang, most of that state's formal institutions enslaved at least one African. Indeed, there were plantations throughout Connecticut, and while they were generally referred to as farms, the scale of these enterprises and the number of their slave personnel would have marked them as plantations had they been in the American South, the Caribbean, or South America. The North was home to at least 472 textile mills in 1860, 7 in Thompson, Connecticut alone. During the decades 1830 to 1840, New England mills processed in excess of 100 million pounds of cotton grown in the South. Failed investment bank Lehman Brothers began as a cotton brokerage in Montgomery, Alabama in 1850 and would become the state of Alabama's fiscal agent. The company's founder, Henry Lehman, immigrated from Reparations, Germany to Montgomery in 1844 and immediately set up a modest shop selling groceries, dry goods, and utensils to area cotton farmers. Buoyed by strong sales, he was joined by his brothers Emanuel and Meyer in 1850, and together they went into the commodities brokerage business, constructed a cotton storage warehouse, and became the area's largest buyers and sellers of cotton, phasing out their general merchandising enterprises. Like all Southern businesses, Lehman Brothers struggled during the Civil War period, and as Reconstruction unfolded, family members focused on relocating their operations to New York City. But cotton continued to trump all domestic trades, and in 1870, Lehman Brothers spearheaded the formation of the New York Cotton Exchange, the first commodities futures trading venture. So Meyer Lehman would be appointed appointed to his first board of directors. Real estate and shipping tycoon John Jacob Astor made his fortune in furs, the Chinese opium trade, and transporting cotton to the world's ports. Jeweler Charles Louis Tiffany opened the iconic flagship shop Tiffany's on New York City's Broadway Street in 1837 with capital from his father, Comfort Tiffany, whose own fortune had been derived from the operation of a cotton manufacturing company in what would become Danielsonville, Connecticut. New York City was booming in the late 1830s, largely as a consequence of the cotton trade. There was Archibald Gracie Jr., the son of Scottish international shipper Archibald Gracie of Gracie Mansion fame, who left New York City to become a cotton broker in Mobile, Alabama. The cotton producing states were integrally connected to the fortunes of New Yorkers. So slave-grown cotton made the expansion of the area's textile mills possible. Some 472 institutions in 1860. One Connecticut town, Thompson, was the home to 7 mills. During the decades 1830 to 1840, New England mills processed in excess of 100 million pounds of cotton grown in the South. By 1860, 10 major cotton producing states in the South, home to 2.3 million enslaved Africans, lived on 75,000 cotton plantations, produced 66% of the world's cotton, and raw cotton accounted for more than half of all US exports. Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, and Belgium were all dependent on US cotton. At least 2 Connecticut towns were built on the global production and milling of African-based ivory, clearly an industry that would not have existed without the slave trade. Some of you may be familiar with Katrina Brown's film Traces of the Trade and her cousin Thomas Norman DeWolf's book on the DeWolf family story. Inheriting the Trade, a Northern family confronts its legacy as the largest slave trading dynasty in US history. They look at their ancestors' extensive role in the lucrative slave trade market. Hiring captains and crews throughout New England, they participated in the 1,000 plus voyages to Africa that brought over 100,000 captives to the Americas. Throughout New England, shipyards emerged to build the vessels that would become the ocean-going prisons for African slaves equipped with iron chains and shackles and water tanks. When the slave trade was legally abolished in this country in 1808, buying and selling Black bodies simply went underground. The privileges and pampered life participants could obtain from the centuries-long practice were too enticing and familiar to resist. Indeed, the Complicity authors report, quote, a conservative estimate is that during the illegal trade's peak years, 1859 to 1860, at least 2 slave ships, each built to hold between 600 and 1,000 slaves, left Lower Manhattan every month.
I'm going to shift a bit in terms of the flow of our conversation, and I want to focus on the misperceptions that people have about why we have a racial wealth gap in the United States today. We want to talk about the misperceptions because we think this constitutes a barrier to the embrace of the importance and value of the United States legislating a reparations plan. And so these misperceptions concern the sources and the causes of economic disparity between Blacks and whites in the United States. And so I'd like to start with a catalog of what some of those misperceptions are. So we say the following in From Here to Equality. A Pew Research Center survey conducted in 2016 reveals the prevalence of mistaken beliefs. Researchers found that large proportions of both whites and blacks affirm there is no lingering racial financial disparity. An astonishing 38% of blacks contended that blacks are at least as well off or better off financially than whites. Among whites, the proportion sharing that opinion was 42%. In addition, 38% of white respondents believe the nation has already made all the policy changes needed to give blacks equal rights with whites. A majority of white respondents thought blacks are treated as fairly as whites in the courts. More than 70% of whites thought that blacks are treated similarly to whites when applying for a loan or a mortgage in the workplace, in restaurants, and when voting in elections. Less than 40% of blacks shared the same views on their treatment in the courts, in seeking a loan or mortgage, or in the workplace, but a majority of blacks shared the same views as most whites on their treatment in restaurants, 51%, and in the voting process, 57%. Half of whites believe blacks are treated as fairly as whites in their encounters with the police. Now here there was a difference, in contrast with a mere 16% of blacks. More than 60% of whites believe racial discrimination continues to be an important barrier to blacks getting ahead. 47% of whites rejected the notion that lower quality schools constituted an obstacle for blacks, and 55% of whites rejected the idea that a lack of jobs prevents blacks from getting ahead. In all three of these cases, at least 66% of black respondents surveyed thought these factors significantly inhibit black achievement. However, with respect to factors associated with self-defeating deficiencies in the black community as important reasons for blacks not getting ahead, white and black respondents held similar views. A striking 43% of blacks said a lack of motivation to work hard is an important factor producing black-white inequality, in contrast with only 30% of whites. Even higher proportions of both groups attributed any ongoing black-white gaps to family instability, 57% of blacks and 55% of whites, and to the lack of good role models, 51% of blacks and 52% of whites. So while there were sharp differences in black and white perceptions of the role of societal factors in perpetuating racial economic inequality, there was a sharp convergence on the role of alleged cultural behavioral factors. A significant proportion of blacks bought the view alleging that black dysfunction helps explain racial inequality in the United States. Moreover, to the extent that the respondents to the Pew survey saw racism as having any ongoing impact, more of them, both white, 70%, and black, a plurality of 48%, emphasized individual prejudice as the problem rather than the system of laws and institutions. And so structural racism, at least at that point, was not something that was taken seriously. I understand that today, in the aftermath of the onset of the coronavirus crisis and the widespread recognition, finally, of sustained anti-Black police violence, the phrase structural racism has finally entered into the national parlance. But as of 2016, it was not something that was viewed as a significant explanation for Black-white disparities. And so I'd like to confront those perceptions with some evidence that's associated with the racial wealth disparity that we talked about a bit earlier. So let me share the following passages from Here to Equality. One powerful example that challenges the thinking of those who prefer America's feel-good myth of equality is provided by a close analysis of wealth disparity in this country. Wealth is the best single indicator of the cumulative impact of white racism over time. Wealth, the difference between what we own and what we owe, or the difference between the value of our assets and our debts, or the net value of our property, is the economic measure that best captures individual, family, and household well-being. Wealth serves as a primary indicator of economic security. Wealthier families are better positioned to finance elite independent school and college education, access capital to start a business, finance expensive medical procedures, reside in higher amenity neighborhoods, exert political influence through campaign financing, purchase better counsel if confronted with an expensive legal system, leave a bequest, and/or withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies, such as job loss or a catastrophic illness. Wealth provides financial agency over one's life. Simply put, wealth gives individuals and families choice. It provides economic security to take risk and shield against financial loss. Now, among Black households with positive net worth, there does tend to be a greater reliance on home ownership as a source of wealth than among white households. Customarily, we have assumed that equity in a home was a secure and stable source of wealth, but recent experience during the Great Recession has torpedoed that belief. The collapse of home ownership and equity value in homes has affected Black households adversely and disproportionately. Moreover, home ownership and total wealth do not track each other as closely as many Americans imagine. For example, a survey conducted in the Los Angeles metropolitan area in 2014-2015 demonstrates that the rate of African American home ownership, 42%, is slightly higher than that of the city's Asian Indians, 40%, an immigrant community consisting disproportionately of highly educated, affluent professionals. On the basis of home ownership rates, one might expect that the two Los Angeles communities would have similar net worth. However, the median Asian Indian household net worth was $460,000, as opposed to only $4,000 for African Americans, less than 1% of the former. The difference appears to be due to the greater rates and levels of ownership of financial assets by Asian Indian households. 59% of Asian Indian households own stocks, mutual funds, and investment trusts, while only 22% of African American households own the same types of assets. The capacity even to enter markets for remunerative financial assets is contingent on having a significant endowment of wealth in the first place. Now, some have suggested that the racial wealth gap is explained by Black profligacy, Blacks' unwillingness to commit to a careful plan of saving, and Blacks' ignorance about proper investment practices. A virtual cottage industry is developed to provide financial literacy to Black families, but it is striking that there is very little, if any, evidence to support the claim that Black saving behavior is the source of the enormous racial wealth gap. If we consider Black and white families with similar income levels, we discovered no significant difference in savings rates, nor a difference in rates of return on their personal investments. In fact, in some income categories, Blacks display a higher rate of savings. Somehow, Blacks manage to have a savings profile comparable to whites with similar income levels, despite the fact that Blacks have more kin obligation because their relatives are more likely to be in need than those of comparably situated whites. These family obligations reduce the total income available for saving and wealth building. Nevertheless, the Black savings rate is comparable to the white savings rate at each level of household income. Final passage that I'd like to share in this context is the following. We say, the belief that Blacks lack motivation and effort is contradicted by the evidence on racial differences in educational attainment. For comparable levels of family socioeconomic status, Black youth obtain more years of schooling and credentials, including college degrees, than white youth. Moreover, unfortunately, motivation and effort are not enough to close the Black-white wealth gap. Data from both the Survey of Income and Program Participation and the Survey of Consumer Finances provide the facts. Black household heads with a college or university degree have about $10,000 less in median net worth than white household heads who never completed high school. Blacks who are working full-time have a lower median net worth than whites who are unemployed. Blacks in the third quintile of the income distribution have similar levels of median wealth as whites in the lowest quintile. That means that on average, Blacks whose incomes were about $60,000 in 2014 had a level of median wealth of about $22,000, while whites whose incomes were less than $26,000 had a median wealth of about $18,000. Blacks in the lowest quintile had a median wealth of a paltry $200. So is that what we'd like to do for our presentation? Yeah, we'll stop there, and that'll give us plenty of time to engage with folks for questions and answers.
Thank you both really very much for, quite frankly, riveting presentation. So thank you very, very much.
The first question comes from Stephen, who you mentioned how the racial wealth gap is intrinsically tied to slavery. So are reparations meant to fulfill every problem of racial inequality, or just specifically target the racial wealth gap? And should it aim to solve every problem?
Okay, so there are two different questions. The first is implicit in the initial observation. No, we don't think that the wealth gap is tied directly to slavery per se. In fact, I think we're fairly emphatic in our book about the notion that the origins of the wealth gap really start in the aftermath of slavery. Now, of course, it's clear that the formerly enslaved emerge from their years of bondage virtually penniless. They have no resources. They have to acquire resources in the best ways that they possibly can. But they did have a promise of restitution in the form of 40-acre land grants that were supposed to be distributed to them. Those 40-acre land grants, apart from an initial small allocation to 40,000 of the 4 million formerly enslaved of about 400,000 acres, apart from that, there was no provision for restitution that was actually made. And among the 40,000 who received the 400,000 acres, as a consequence of President Andrew Johnson's resistance to a proper plan for reconstruction, that land was taken away from them, and it was returned to the former slaveholders. And in fact, Andrew Johnson completely gutted the reconstruction effort in such a way that it denied Black Americans the material basis for entry into full citizenship in the United States. And so we think that that's the starting point for the racial wealth gap. It's not slavery in and of itself, it's a failure to provide restitution for the years of bondage that's critical. And this occurs at the same time that 1.5 million white American families are receiving land grants of 160 acres under the terms of the Homestead Act in the western part of the United States to complete the nation's colonial settler project. So Black Americans who emerged from slavery do not get the land that was formerly held by the slaveholders. They get nothing. But white Americans get a substantial amount of a national handout, if you will, of land resources in the western part of the United States. So that's the first point. The second question, the question itself concerned whether or not reparations could solve all problems, and we don't make that claim. There's an important distinction that we find in a passage that we quote from Malcolm X in the book, in which Malcolm X is drawing an analogy between the way in which policy functions and a situation in which an individual has had a knife plunged into his back. I think Malcolm talks about it being plunged into his own back. And he distinguishes between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. So from our perspective, the kinds of conditions that are described in the question that was asked require pulling the knife out and keeping it out. And there's a particular set of policies that would be required for that. For example, you would need to have ongoing anti-discrimination measures to try to preclude sustained discrimination. But on the other hand, reparations from our perspective is healing the wound, providing compensation for the damages that have been incurred. And so as a consequence, we think that that's best affected by closing the racial wealth gap in the United States. But we do not make the claim that every single policy or problem would be resolved exclusively by a reparations project.
Yeah, this next question comes from Andrea, who asks, can you please outline the eligibility criteria for reparations? There's much public debate about who should be included and the quote, insurmountable challenges to identifying eligible recipients.
Thank you for that question very much, Andrea. So for us, there are two criteria that an individual would need to meet in order to qualify for reparations. One is an identity standard and the other is a lineage standard. So in the case of the lineage criterion, the individual would need to prove that they were descended from at least one person who was enslaved in the United States. Right? And in the case of the identity standard, this individual would need to have identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro at least 12 years prior to the enactment of a reparations study commission or the enactment of an actual reparations program. So another part of that question you asked. It's not just about eligibility.
No, I think.
Oh, I wanted to say too, one of the things that we advocate is for this reparations commission to set up an agency, an agency of genealogists who would assist individuals in establishing their claims, helping them to conduct research on their own families so that they could determine if in fact they were eligible to receive reparations.
Yeah.
The next question comes from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, what can and should colleges and universities such as Brown and Duke do to help create reparations? What would you like to see universities doing as part of their responsibilities, especially those who have profited from enslaved labor?
It's interesting. When we, were first writing From Here to Equality, we had imagined that colleges and universities would be on the vanguard of this movement and that they would lead the charge. And surprisingly, that has not been the case. But we do think that there is a tremendous amount of work that colleges and universities could do. They could put their considerable, muscle and power and reputation to work advocating for a national program of reparations. And so what would that look like? They could develop resolution advocating for reparations and petition and lobby Congress for a full program of reparations for Black descendants of US slavery, Black descendants. They could decide to engage lobbying corporations to do a full-scale campaign, with ads and all across media, convening events like this one. But yes, there's a lot that they could do to advocate the cause. Colleges and universities, especially, institutions like Brown, have a lot of clout and people listen. You're thought leaders, and we would say too, you have an obligation to step in and do your part.
When Ruth Simmons was president of Brown, as most of you know, there was actually a report that was commissioned to try to examine Brown's complicity with slavery and the slave trade. And it was my impression or my belief that report would lead Brown to be at the very front of the effort to promote a national program for reparations. But that has not been the case. I think most colleges and universities that have engaged in some form of atonement once they have acknowledged their complicity with America's sordid past, have either put up statues and memorials to the persons who were enslaved, who worked at their universities, or they have taken down statues that represent individuals who were enslavers or lost cause advocates, or change the names on some of their buildings. But in terms of a substantive effort to pursue a national program for reparations, they typically have not done that. What frequently happens is, though, what I call is throwing scholarships at the problem, and you know, that's something that's very popular because people want education to be the panacea for all of the problems we confront in the United States. And now, let me be clear: I am a fervent advocate of education. However, we have to be honest about its limitations. And so educational attainment is not going to do very much to eliminate the racial wealth gap. As I pointed out a little bit earlier from our text, Blacks who have college degrees at the median have $10,000 less in net worth than whites, heads of household, who never finished high school.
Can you discuss the bill HR 40, including what you might see as its possible prospects in Congress?
Yeah, we could.
A thorny topic.
Last week, I think I put out an opinion piece on HR 40 that was published by Actify Press. So if people are interested in reading it, you can put my last name in the browser, Actify Press, and the article will pop up. But I think we'll both comment on this, but we've long been concerned that HR 40, which is legislation to establish a commission to study the case for reparations and to provide proposals for reparations to the United States Congress, that the legislation to enable such a commission really is deeply flawed. And it's flawed in large measure because it does not provide a direct avenue to three critical components that a reparations plan must have. The first component is establishing who is eligible. The commission should have a directive over whom should be eligible. So from our perspective, it's Black American descendants of US slavery. Secondly, the commission should have a directive that the reparations plan that it generates have as its primary target elimination of the racial wealth gap. And then third, the commission should have as a directive the generation of a plan for reparations that privileges direct payments to eligible recipients. And to the extent that the existing legislation does not have those directives and is quite open to the possibility of folks sitting on the commission who have a very different point of view about what a reparations plan should look like, we think that that's highly problematic.
Our hope is that HR 40 is significantly revised before it's voted upon. And this again is another opportunity for all of you to let your legislators know your thoughts about HR 40. If these are points that matter to you, let them know that.
I think one of the other things of concern to us is that the bill provides conditions for GS 18 level payments of salaries to the commissioners, and we think that this is a problem in the context of this particular piece of legislation, which in a sense constitutes a sacred mission. And so we don't think that there should be any hint of impropriety or any possibility of conflict of interest arising as a consequence of payments to the commissioners. This is a piece of legislation where the commissioners should not receive salaries. Certainly their normal expenses should be paid, and there should be a salaried professional staff to support their efforts, but the individual commissioners should not receive salaries.
Two other points that involve the time frame. One, we would like to see those payments to eligible recipients be made within a decade. But in order for that to happen, the commission itself needs to be efficient. We know that the commissioners who made up the entity that was focused on Japanese American reparations. This was the redress that was made available to the Japanese Americans who were wrongfully interned during World War II. That commission completed its research, a number of hearings across the country, and its final report within 18 months. And so, as written, HR 40 does not have any kind of horizon. There's no deadline for the commission to deliberate
deliver a final
report as the document is currently written, and we'd like to see that changed.
Next question comes from Jim, who read and greatly enjoyed the book and asks, in your final section about the specifics of reparations, I thought perhaps you diluted the effect of your program by suggesting that it could be paid out over time, as that would minimize creating better wealth equality. But perhaps I misunderstood what you suggested. Any comments?
Let's talk about the inflation.
Yeah. Our motive for recommending that it be paid out over time, and we wanted to set a deadline for it to be paid out, a maximum of 10 years. But the reason for proposing that is because we think that the biggest obstacle to any new federal expenditure for any purpose is the inflation risk. And so we were trying to set up the program in such a way that we could reduce the likelihood that it would be responsible for generating higher levels of inflation. And so one way of doing that is to stagger the payments so that there's less of an allocation that's taking place in any single year. And so that's the motive. It's not related to any other dimension of what we think is important with the reparations project.
Right. When you think about the reparations payments that the CWRC, the Commission on Wartime Relocation of Interned Civilians, operated under, you're talking about a much smaller number of individuals and also a much lower claim.
Mm-hmm.
So
Was it
$20,000 for about 120,000 people.
Yeah.
So there was not a significant concern about inflation in that case, but this is a much more substantial claim, and one needs to be thinking about inflation.
So this is I guess potentially 40 million eligible recipients, approximately $250,000 to $300,000 per person. So that's a very different ballpark from the one that encircled the Japanese American restitution for unjust incarceration in World War II.
This next question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, since slavery and its cumulative effects have created and reinforced a legacy of race discrimination, under what conditions do you envision that the elimination of racial inequality as required for closure could be achieved? Do you view reparations as a necessary precursor to dismantling structural racism, or should structural racism be addressed before reparations can be effective?
Oh, please don't wait. To appropriate reparations, while we wait on structural racism to evaporate.
That's like, do we have to destroy capitalism before we can provide reparations?
Right.
So
there's different things.
There's this outstanding debt, 155 years going, that needs to be met. And so, we think that there has to be, and now to be honest, there has to be some moderation of anti-Black sentiment in the United States for a reparations project to be passed by the United States Congress. We are largely opposed to efforts to try to accomplish reparations through the judicial route. we think that it is something that has to be legislated by Congress, and that will require some significant support from the majority of Americans. And so there would have to be some changes that are taking place in the way in which people perceive Black people in the United States and the ways in which they perceive a reparations project in the first place. But that doesn't mean that structural racism would be at an end. We would still need those policies to pull the knife out.
I'm going to combine two questions from Melissa and Shirley, and it's about identifying recipients. And under the circumstances of slavery, where one's name is given and not your own, and records were often not available or destroyed, isn't the lineage standard really difficult to meet? I think that the identity standard exists because it's so difficult to determine, but I'm not clear on exactly what that entails. And about identifying recipients and Black descendants of slaves, are you recommending a minimum percentage, like a greater or lesser 25%, something like that?
So to answer the latter part first, no. One would simply need to prove that one was descended from, a Black American and had done so for at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations commission or reparations program, that one was descended from someone who was enslaved in the United States.
At least one person.
At least one person. There could be many, but you just need one. Okay. And then you address the first part.
What was the first part?
So the first part was about this whole question of, how
difficult it is
to.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have genealogical services provided to potential claimants at no cost to them. But there's a tremendous amount of expertise that has emerged among African-American genealogists that have made it quite feasible for them to identify enslaved ancestors, or at least one enslaved ancestor in somebody's family tree. And to the extent that they can build up a network of information about this, it becomes possible to facilitate doing this with other individuals who might be related to somebody who is making the claim. But we also think that there's actually a very interesting direct route that's based upon omission that can provide guidance to whom was enslaved. So if you could identify an ancestor in the 1870 census who was old enough to have appeared in the 1850 or 1860 census, if that individual did not appear in the 1850 or 1860 census, that is probably prima facie evidence that they were enslaved, because there was no enumeration of individuals who were enslaved in the 1850 and 1860 censuses. And so I think that there's there's a silence in the censuses that could be exploited for the purposes of providing proof or evidence that one had an enslaved ancestor.
Thank you. The next question comes from Kristen, who asks, how do you think Nicole Hannah Jones's 1619 project can, will, or has changed misperceptions about the racial wealth gap in the US?
I don't know that anyone has studied that per se. Certainly individuals who read the publication or any of the many supplementary materials that have been created both by the New York Times and the Pulitzer Project, one could definitely learn a lot more about the racial wealth gap. There are a lot of references that are mentioned, that are cited in the work, including our book, From Here to Equality. So there is certainly the opportunity for individuals to read and learn more. But I'm, no liberty to say how many hearts and minds were actually changed as a consequence. I think it's important to have this sort of panoply of materials available. There's a certain kind of momentum, I think, that's created when you have, access to new information or information that is maybe not new from the standpoint of it's being newly created, but newly available. When you're able to hold that alongside the, the many horrors that we are seeing, in the news as a consequence of the devices that we have that are bringing the realities of the lives that many Black people are living into the homes, the living rooms of, all Americans and people around the world. So I would hope that the confluence of all of these things is having a positive effect and causing individuals to kind of rethink some of the perceptions that they have long held. And certainly one could consult the references in those materials or the references in From Here to Equality to learn more.
I think that it's very helpful and useful to have the materials that have been developed in the 1619 project available. There is an irony. There's been a substantial amount of pushback against the project, particularly from right-wing circles in the United States, but not solely from right-wing circles. But one form of the pushback that's come from right-wing circles has been the so-called 1776 project as an argument that we have to start the analysis of America's past with the formation of the Republic, and that was a glorious moment. The irony for us is that our analysis of the case for Black reparations starts in 1776 with the formation of the Republic, which we do not view as a glorious moment. In fact, what's really distinctive about the United States in 1776 is it comes into existence as a slave republic. And that's critical to our analysis. So 1619 doesn't have the same significance for our study, but it certainly does have a great deal of significance for understanding the full sweep of enslavement and white supremacy in North America, at least. Yeah.
The next question comes from Sharonda, who asks, how do we ensure that payments will have a positive impact that will result in progress?
Sure, how Sharonda is measuring progress, but certainly I think the individuals who receive the payments will be pleased to receive them. We can't determine what individuals how they'll put the funds to use.
Nor should we.
Nor should we. I mean, this is not, it's not our business how they use those funds. When you look at the various payments, reparations payments that were made to the victims of the Holocaust, that were made to the Japanese Americans who were illegally incarcerated during World War II, when you look at the individuals from around the world who were injured or who lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks, or the children and the educators who lost their lives or were injured at Sandy Hook, no one said, well, how are they going to spend that money? So we are kind of curious about, why when the potential recipients of restitution is Black Americans, we begin to ask these questions about, well, how are they spending the money? So it just seems there's a kind of inequity there that we find troublesome, kind of questionable.
Thank you. The next question comes from Melissa, who asks, I'm confused by the argument of some Blacks against reparations on the basis that it reduces Blacks to a status of victimhood. How do you view this argument?
So our position is if there are individuals who truly feel that there's this atrocious victimhood status that they will incur by receiving reparations, then they personally can say no to the reparations payment. It's not mandatory that you take the restitution. So if they really feel that they'll be psychologically damaged by receipt of restitution, then just say no. But let the rest of us have the option of receiving the restitution.
Say a little bit more about Melissa's question. When we looked at what the formerly enslaved said as the Civil War was ending. And I'm speaking here of the meeting in Savannah, Georgia, in 1865 with General William Sherman, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and a Reverend Garrison Frazier, who was a spokesperson for 20 other members of the clergy who came together to talk about what the next steps were going to be. Abraham Lincoln had already authorized several experiments with Blacks who were the contraband, farming their own land, harvesting crops and selling them at fixed prices to the federal government. And so these two different officers, two different spokespersons for the government, come together with this Black minister in Savannah, Georgia, and they ask him, what do the freedmen need? What is it going to take to get them started? And he didn't say, oh, we don't want anything from the federal government because, to do so would make us feel victimized, or this would somehow tarnish the reputations of our ancestors or our forebears. That's not what they said at all. He said, we want land. Basically, we want restitution, and we need a livelihood. And so, they weren't thinking about. They were trying to avoid becoming victims of, oppression. They were trying to avoid being homeless, to avoid being without resources, to be without a source of a livelihood. And so, I applaud them, and I want to echo what they were saying in 1865. I think that a program of restitution honors the ancestors, and it finally would, be a way of saying, yes, absolutely, you were wronged, and your fight has been our fight, and that we would be victims no more. That is the hope of closure. The third prong of ARC. That if no further atrocities were committed against Black Americans as a people, and none of the previous atrocities were repeated, then we would all go forth together, in this newly configured America.
Redress is what is required to remove victimhood status. You don't remove victimhood status by ignoring the effects of the process of victimization.
Thank you. The next question comes from an anonymous attendee who's asking if you could please describe the various precedents for reparations in other populations, including enslavers.
Okay.
So you talk about restitution that was given to the
slave holders
themselves. Okay.
Yes, and other populations. Thank you.
So we've already made mention of at least 4 cases now. We mentioned restitution that was provided by the German government to the victims of the Holocaust. We mentioned payments that were made to Japanese Americans who had been unjustly incarcerated in World War II. We also mentioned the families that lost loved ones in the course of the 9/11 terrorist attacks who received federal payments as restitution. And then some federal monies were paid to the victims, the families of victims of the Sandy Hook massacre. There are some other examples, but those are the key illustrations that we've worked on. But in terms of payments to the slave holders, there is actually only one instance of that in the United States. That's the case of compensated emancipation that was executed in the District of Columbia. This is what, 1862? Yeah, that's the only instance in the United States. However, to the extent that the land that they formerly held was restored to the slaveholders in the United States, this was an act that was probably the equivalent of being as damaging as actually having paid them for releasing enslaved people. And in fact, compensated emancipation, had it been executed on a nationwide basis, would have precluded the Civil War being the mechanism to produce emancipation. You could have had maintenance of the Union, and you could have had the freedom of the enslaved without going to war, had the slaveholders agreed to compensated emancipation. And it was an option that was continually presented to them. The other major case of compensated emancipation has to do with the United Kingdom and its process of conducting emancipation in its West Indian colonies, where slaveholders were paid substantial amounts of money for the purposes of emancipation. Now, there's another peculiar case, the Haitian case. Yeah, you want to talk about that?
So this is not a payment to slaveholders per se, but Haiti was made to pay reparations to France, for its loss of, sovereignty and control of Haiti, which is quite absurd. We would hope that those funds would be returned to Haiti with interest. Yes.
If I could just say something quickly on the Haitian case, that one of the fascinating things was in the negotiation process, what you really had were formerly enslaved people who were now in the army or in the government, who they were talking to their slave masters about, okay, you mean I will now have to pay you for my freedom? Those are some of the things that came up in that negotiation process.
Yeah.
Which I think is really very instructive for us to think about.
Isn't it really difficult to trace one's lineage all the way back to enslaved, when names were changed, no records kept or burned up, no DNA repositories? So do you have an estimate at what percentage of the current US population of Black African Americans do you expect to be successful in this lineage criteria?
We are hopeful that all who are eligible can establish their claim. This is really a repetition of the same question that was asked a little bit earlier. I'm not sure that we can offer a different answer.
The next question comes from Marcus, who says that capitalism prioritizes capital and growth over people, over the environment, etc. It requires the exploitation of labor and the subjugation of mass groups of people to perform this labor. It requires policing, law and order, the protection of property, etc. Hundreds of millions of people have been and continue to be killed, dispossessed of the land they're occupying, enslaved, put in cages, etc., in the name of capital and expansion. More Black wealth does absolutely nothing to address any of this. I'm just very confused as to how any analysis of anti-Blackness and how to, quote, move forward together fails to recognize the inherent inequality in this political economic system.
So I think the presumption here is that there are no inequalities in other types of social systems. Hierarchy is something that's very commonplace across varieties of social systems. Capitalism is one case, but there are also systems that I guess we now refer to as actually existing socialism, which have its own forms of hierarchy and exploitation as well. The question for us is the issue of a grievous injustice that has carried across multiple generations, that has denied Black Americans the material conditions for full citizenship in the United States. It's a debt that needs to be paid, and it's a debt that needs to be paid regardless of what the social system or the overarching social system is. I will say this, one thing that's unique about the way in which we conceive of a reparations plan is that we would want to make equal payments to all recipients. This would mean in turn that the Black American community would have an extraordinarily high degree of wealth equality. And this would be unique, and this would be game-changing in terms of the way in which this country functions and lives. I think we estimate that you would go from a situation in which the ratio of the median to mean level of wealth among Black Americans would rise from about 13% to 87%. And this would be unprecedented. And so the Black American population would look very different within whichever social system is surrounding it in some sense. And its capability to actually act on that system and perhaps hopefully change it for the better would be a lot different than its capability is in the present moment.
Again, we're kind of piggybacking all of these issues, on Black people. It's incumbent on all of us to dig in and do our part. Reparations has a lot of challenges, but a lot of promise as well. But it's not a spectator sport. There are roles that each of us can play, and I think sometimes I wonder when we when we lump all of these things together, is that just a way of saying I just can't deal with this at all? I'm just gonna stand over here to the side and just be a spectator, or I'm not gonna watch, as opposed to if this individual would identify one or two of these concerns and try to figure out what kind of work they want to do, how they want to engage with that issue. But it just seems that by coming up with this incredible list, it just feels so overwhelming. And so my suggestion, my hope would be this individual would figure out which of these concerns is most pressing to them in this moment and begin to work on them specifically.
I think a related point is, should we be paralyzed in addressing the nation's debts for atrocities by the fact that it doesn't overturn capitalism per se? And I think the answer to that is no.
Melissa mentions that the process of truth and reconciliation seems vital for the oppressors and people who benefit from it to know enough about the atrocities to be able to apologize authentically. How does that come about? Doesn't there need to be a shared ground about the depth of what was experienced?
So one of the roles of a reparations commission would be to conduct that research, to look at the country's history, all of it, from the beginning, in our view, from the beginning of the formation of the Republic, and to basically create a document that spells all of this out. That would be the basis for this conversation that Melissa is talking about. The document would indicate if reparations was deemed to be necessary, and why, and what it should be. So yes, I think it is important for us to have this understanding of our truth, and in order for reparations to happen, I think reconciliation is down the road. You need to have reparations first.
Well, it's not even reconciliation.
We were never, conciliatory to begin with, right? So, but and I think about the Truth and Reconciliations commissions around the world that, had varying degrees of success. Sometimes the difficulty from our point of view is that they didn't. So let's take South Africa, for example. The goal was never to eradicate the racial wealth gap, which is unfortunate. They were, from my understanding, far more interested in collecting the narrative of what had happened, what the atrocities were. Now, what ended up happening, though, was that the witnesses who were brought forth were allowed to present their cases as if the two sides were equal, as if there was a debate about what had happened. Whereas
so there were bad people on both sides.
Right. So
as opposed to good people.
As opposed to saying, this is a horrible thing that happened in South Africa. Huge numbers of people were affected these Black South Africans lost control of their country for a long period of time, and their case is ascendant. That's not what came out of that Truth and Reconciliation process. And so I think you need to be really careful about how you set out the framework for such a commission, so that you get the kind of information coming on the outside, on the other side, that you
There was
need.
no,
And there's no significant reparations.
restitution that was made. Yeah.
Very few, very small number of individuals received reparations payments, and they were incredibly small, just infinitesimally small.
This question comes from Joseph, who asks, do you foresee potential risks of white and non-Black backlash after reparations were paid, and what could be done to mitigate those risks and protect those who are receiving the reparations?
Yeah. Well, this is always a possibility. Our sense is that it would have to be backlash from a minority of the U.S. population, but that minority could be substantial enough for it to be dangerous. In the aftermath of the Civil War, had the formerly enslaved actually received 40 acres, it would have been essential for either the Union Army to maintain a much longer presence in the South, and or provide arms to the formerly enslaved so that they could protect themselves. So to the extent that we can anticipate that there might be some sort of backlash among the minority of Americans who remain opposed to reparations that could result in violent outbreaks, it would be necessary to be prepared for that eventuality. And it might be essential to have the National Guard and the military on notice to be prepared to take action against any types of violent outbreaks that are conducted by white terrorists.
I agree. It's startling to see how quickly things deteriorated at the end of the Civil War. We quote at length from Whitelaw Reid and Carl Schurz. Reid was a reporter who was making his way across the South and writing for the Atlantic, and Schurz was actually an agent of President Andrew Johnson's. And they were talking about how initially whites across the South were braced for change. They were so despondent. They were so consumed with taking care of the wounded and trying to resume some kind of life, livelihood, that they recognized that it would be worth their while to agree to co-govern with Blacks so that they could be readmitted to the Union. This was the moment when it would have been, we believe, possible for Blacks to become fully enfranchised, to participate in the political life. If the 40 acres had been, 30-acre land grants had been made available, it would have changed things dramatically. And so, but that didn't happen, right? And so, again, this would be another case where it's like we've seen this movie before. So we know that it's important to protect Black rights in this moment. And that if you don't, there are potentially negative consequences. And we also know what that might look like. So I think that, yes, it would be very helpful to be thinking about all of this ahead of time and to put those protections in place.
This question comes from Stephen, who asks, where do you anticipate the money for reparations to come from?
The magic war chest. So, recent years have shown us that when we need to bail out banks, we cut a check. When we need to insure businesses and eventually individuals in a pandemic, we cut checks. And so we would say that same mechanism could be used for reparations. I mean, I'm not being, I don't mean to just flip entirely, but what these two events have shown us in the last 15 years is that the US government has tremendous capacity to fund initiatives that it chooses to fund. Taxes didn't go up. You know, there wasn't this huge burden. There wasn't inflation. We can do this. The question is, do we have the will to do it? You know, ours is a sovereign nation. We can, you could ask the treasurer, the Federal Reserve to make those funds available. It has been done, it can be done, and it should be done for Black reparations.
Really riveting, you know, a riveting dialogue. Allowed those of us who were listening to sharpen our focus on the reparations from your particular, both of your particular perspectives. And I encourage folks to buy the book. I'm sure you have a copy of it somewhere sitting there. If you show us a copy, if you have one, the front of it, the front cover.
It's a little bit better.
Ours is beat up.
It's kind of
That's
better.
okay. That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I recommend that to all our viewers. And once again, to thank you both very much for coming on this webinar. Thank you all very much, and to everybody, have a good evening.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good night.